My stepdad started acting differently towards me at night. I never expected that a normal life with my stepfather would turn into such secret moments. Stay With Me is a story about how everyday life can hide a tension that changes everything. My name is Anya, and our house always seemed perfectly ordinary. We'd have breakfast together, talk about our day, and go shopping. But since the day my mom got married, I've been catching myself feeling something strange. His gaze lingers on me a little longer than it should. His words sound softer than simple concern. Sometimes we'll sit in the kitchen in the evening, drinking tea and chatting about little things, and suddenly the silence becomes so thick that every one of his gestures feels almost personal. Sometimes he accidentally touches my hand when he hands me a mug, and in those brief touches, something more than just daily life is hidden. Sometimes everything seemed absolutely routine. He'd sit on the couch with a newspaper or his phone. I'd walk past to my room and feel his quick glance on me. I tried to pretend I didn't notice, but inside something fluttered every time. In the evening, we would set the table together, and he might casually joke, "You do everything more carefully than your mom." He'd smile in a way that would make me blush, not knowing how to reply. Sometimes he would get too close to grab a plate or a mug from the table, and our hands would brush. These moments only lasted for a second, but in those moments I could feel an invisible tension between us in our very ordinary home. A tension no one but us noticed. This was most noticeable in the evenings, after Mom had gone to bed and we were left alone in the kitchen. I'd put on the kettle, and he would sit across from me and just watch as I poured the tea. Our conversations were simple, about work, about what we needed to buy tomorrow. But a hidden subtext was tucked into those words. Sometimes he would deliberately reach for the sugar, even though it was closer to me, and our fingers would meet. He'd hold my hand for a moment longer than he needed to, and I'd pretend everything was fine, even though my heart would start to beat faster in my chest. In those minutes, even the silence felt loud, and simple everyday things turned into a game we both understood but never spoke out loud. Sometimes this game would show up in the smallest things. I would be on my laptop in the living room, and he would walk past and stop to ask, "You're not tired, are you?" And there was more care in his voice than just a routine question. He would bring me a cup of tea, set it down next to me and say, "Drink it while it's hot." His hand would casually brush mine, and that brief moment would seem to slow down. Or in the morning when we'd run into each other in the hallway, he might adjust my scarf or hand me my coat. His fingers would linger slightly, and I felt it even more than his words. Everything seemed normal, but it was these small details that filled the house with a special tension that became our little secret world. This feeling was especially strong on weekends. We might go to the store together with Mom staying at home, and he would offer to drive me. In the car, we'd talk about the simplest things: prices, plans for the day, what movie to watch in the evening. But every time he glanced at me, I'd catch that look. A little longer, a little softer than it should have been. At the store, he might take a bag from my hands, saying, "You're carrying too much," and smile in a way that made me feel it wasn't just simple concern. And at home, as we unloaded the groceries, he would sometimes purposely hold my hand as he handed me a bag. In those seconds, it was as if the whole world vanished, leaving just the two of us in a perfectly ordinary kitchen, filled with invisible tension. It became especially noticeable in the evenings when Mom was out late. I would be making dinner, putting a pot on the stove, and he would walk into the kitchen and ask, "Need any help?" Even though he rarely did that before. We'd work side by side. He would be chopping vegetables, I would be stirring the soup, and our hands would cross constantly. He might lean in closer to grab a knife, and I could feel his breath on my cheek. Sometimes he'd crack a light joke. "You're doing everything so seriously, like it's an exam." I would laugh, trying to hide my nervousness. And in that ordinary silence, amidst the clinking of dishes and the smell of food, something more than just our usual routine was swirling between us. Then we would sit down to dinner, just the two of us. The kitchen light was soft, it was getting dark outside, and even the usual sounds, the clink of a spoon, the rustle of the tablecloth, seemed louder than usual. He always sat across from me, and our eyes met more often than they needed to. I'd try to change the subject to the food or the news, but then he might suddenly say, "You make everything so tidy like you're the lady of the house," and look at me so intently that I didn't know where to look. Sometimes he would purposely reach for the bread just as I was, and our fingers would touch. It seemed like nothing, but it was these small accidents that made the air thick and the evening not so ordinary as it appeared from the outside. After dinner, we'd clean the table together. He always got up first, but he'd wait for me to take the plates and then he'd get too close to take them from me. His hand would cover mine, and for a second we'd freeze, as if deliberately holding on to that moment. I'd pretend I was busy with the dishes, but my heart would start to beat faster. Sometimes he'd joke, "You try to do everything yourself, but I'm right here." He'd smile that calm smile that made me feel both warmer and more nervous at the same time. We'd stand by the sink. He'd dry the plates, I'd wash them, and in these quiet, simple actions, there was more than in the longest conversations. The atmosphere of the house was familiar, but beneath that familiarity was a subtle flirtation that only we knew about. Sometimes these moments continued in the living room. I'd sit on the couch with a book or a laptop, and he would turn on the TV and, as if by accident, choose a spot right next to me. There was a little space between us, but it would gradually disappear. He'd move a bit closer, or I would inch toward him. He would lean in to see what I was reading and quietly say, "You always lose yourself in your stories." And his voice sounded softer than just a simple comment. I'd respond with a joke, but I'd catch his warm, attentive gaze and couldn't help but smile. Sometimes he'd toss a blanket on the couch and say, "Cover up so you don't get cold." And when I'd take it from his hands, our fingers would meet again. These seemed like the most ordinary evenings, but in every movement, there was a hidden intimacy that we carefully hid from everyone. Sometimes Mom would walk into the room and sit down next to us, and then everything would immediately become ordinary. He'd change the channel and I would pretend to be engrossed in my book. But as soon as she left, the air would change again. He might throw out a short phrase, "You take everything too seriously," and smirk in a way that I knew was part of the game again. I'd reply in the same tone, and our words would sound completely innocent, but we both knew what was hidden behind them. Even the silence between us became special. When the TV was on in the background, and we just sat next to each other, I could feel his presence more strongly than any words. And each one of these evenings added more invisible tension to our ordinary home, making my heart beat faster. I felt this most in the small details. I noticed how he would linger in the kitchen longer than usual if I was there. He might open a cabinet, grab a mug, and lightly brush against my hand as if by accident. Or in the morning, when we'd run into each other in the narrow hallway, he would slightly raise his eyebrows and smile, letting me go first. And his shoulder would brush against mine so closely that I could feel his warmth through my clothes. Sometimes he'd straighten my coat before I left, just saying, "That's better." But he'd do it slowly. His fingers would linger for a moment longer than they should. Everything seemed to stay within the bounds of our daily routine, but it was these little things that made ordinary days special, turning the house into a place where every gesture and every look meant so much more than it seemed. In the evenings, we'd sometimes cross paths in the kitchen when Mom was already asleep. I'd be putting on the kettle, and he would come in for some water and linger nearby. He would sit down at the table, and I would pour the tea and place the mug in front of him. "You're so thoughtful," he would say with a slight smile, and there was more warmth in his voice than simple gratitude. We'd talk about nothing, about work, the news, what we needed to buy tomorrow. But there would be short pauses in these conversations, and then he'd just look at me, not looking away. I tried to make a joke of it, but I could feel my insides tighten. When I handed him the sugar, our fingers would meet again, and in that moment, even the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed too loud. On the outside, it looked like a perfectly normal night, but for me it was always filled with a hidden tension that I couldn't escape. Sometimes these evenings would stretch on. We'd sit in the kitchen longer than we needed to. The mugs had long gone cold, but neither of us was in a hurry to leave. He'd talk about little things, about work, about his plans for tomorrow, and I'd listen more intently than I'd admit to myself. There was a sense of calm in his voice, but every time he looked at me, my insides would flip. He might reach out to adjust the lamp over the table and accidentally touch my shoulder. That brief moment would make me freeze. Sometimes he would suddenly say, "It's quieter here with you," and then fall silent as if he had said too much. I would stay silent too, but I knew that it was in those pauses, in that silence, that the very feeling we were both afraid to name was born. There were evenings when we'd watch TV together. He would pick a channel, I'd sit next to him, and it would seem like there was nothing out of the ordinary. But gradually, the space between us would shrink. His hand would be closer than it should be. The blanket he tossed on the couch would suddenly cover me too. "You're not cold, are you?" he'd ask in a low voice, and that simple question sounded so much deeper than just a caring one. I would nod, trying not to meet his gaze, but I could feel his eyes lingering on me. Sometimes he would start to joke about what was happening on the screen. I would laugh, and in that moment our eyes would meet. It seemed like a normal evening, filled with laughter, conversation, and the warm light of the lamp. But it was in these small things that a quiet, hidden flirtation was born. One that made every moment special and left me with the feeling that we hadn't just been living together for a long time. Sometimes everything would show up even during the day. I would be doing chores around the house, folding laundry, vacuuming, or cooking, and he would seem to find a reason to walk by at that exact moment. "Need a hand?" he would ask, as if he already knew I would say no. But he would stay close by, watching, and in his eyes I could feel something more. When I was reaching for something on the top shelf, he would stand behind me and simply extend his hand higher, easily getting it. And I would inevitably feel his closeness, the smell of his cologne, the warmth from his shoulder. He might straighten a strand of hair that had fallen on my face and say calmly, "That's better." The words sounded normal, but there was too much in those gestures. In the evening, I would remember these small things, and my heart would start to beat faster, as if they were our secret language, understood only by the two of us. This was especially clear on weekends when we were all at home together. Mom might leave to run errands and we'd be left alone doing something simple. He'd be fixing a chair or a shelf, and I would help by handing him tools. I would hand him a screwdriver, our fingers would meet, and he would hold my hand for a moment longer than he needed to. "You're a good helper," he would say. And there was something more than simple gratitude in his smile. Sometimes we would cook together. I'd be chopping vegetables, he'd stand nearby watching, and suddenly he would comment, "You do everything more carefully than Mom." I'd get embarrassed and respond with a joke, but inside I would feel both warm and nervous at the same time. It seemed like a normal day, ordinary chores, but hidden behind them was a tension that only we could feel. Sometimes this would show up even in the briefest moments. I'd walk into the kitchen for some water, and he would already be there. He'd smile and say, "We ran into each other again." That phrase sounded almost accidental, but his look gave away more. He might hand me a glass, even though I could reach it myself, and our fingers would meet. Or when I was reading in the living room, he would walk over, lean in, and ask, "What's interesting?" His voice was calm, but his breath was too close. I'd pretend these were just little things, but my heart would start beating faster in my chest. Even in Mom's presence, there would be brief glances, quick, almost unnoticeable, but clear enough for me. Our house remained the same, familiar. But beneath that familiarity lived an invisible game that made every day special. This was especially noticeable in the evenings when the house became quiet. I would sit at the table with my laptop and he would walk by, and instead of going to his room, he would linger nearby. "Isn't it too late to be working?" he'd ask, looking at the screen, but his attention was clearly not on the text. He would pour himself some tea and put the mug closer to me, as if on purpose, and sit down. We would talk about the most ordinary things, the weather, the news, what we needed to buy tomorrow. But there was a special pause in these conversations. When he would accidentally touch my elbow or shoulder, my breath would catch, and he would just smile, pretending nothing had happened. It seemed like everything was within the bounds of our daily routine, but it was these small moments that turned the silence of the house into a space where something more than just everyday coexistence was swirling between us. Sometimes he'd linger at my bedroom door, as if he wanted to say something, but he'd find an empty excuse to ask if I had turned off the bathroom light or closed the window. His voice was calm, but his gaze lingered longer than it needed to. I would nod, give a short answer, and the same pause would hang in the air, a pause that contained more than any words. Or in the morning when we'd meet in the kitchen, he would pour me tea even though I hadn't asked and say, "You like it sweeter, don't you?" as he handed me the mug. It seemed like nothing special, just thoughtfulness. But his words would make me feel warm and nervous inside. Even when we were just sitting across from each other at the table, it felt like the whole house was silent, watching us. And we would pretend that our relationship was still just an ordinary, everyday one. Sometimes I would catch myself waiting for these moments. A normal evening. Mom is busy with phone calls and he and I are alone in the kitchen. He's slicing bread, I'm getting plates. He purposely hands me what's closer to him, and our hands meet. We glance at each other and immediately look away, as if nothing happened, but the tension remains. Or when he sits on the couch to read the news, I walk past, and without looking up from his screen, he still notices my new sweater. "That looks good on you." I would reply with a short thanks, but I would think about it for a long time afterward. Our conversations and glances were hidden behind the simplest things, but it was in this ordinariness that the same hidden flirtation was born, filling the house with both silence and sparks at the same time. One evening, I was washing the dishes when he walked into the kitchen with a book in his hands. He set it on the table and said, "I can help." Usually I would wave him off, but this time he stood next to me and grabbed a towel. We were silent. Only the water was making noise and the dishes were clinking. His hand touched mine several times as he took the plates, and each time, it felt as if we were purposely holding on to that moment. At one point he suddenly smirked, "You always do everything so carefully." I looked up and he was staring too intently, with that same soft smile that made my heart pound. We quickly went back to what we were doing, but the feeling that something more than just helping out in the kitchen had happened between us stayed with me for the rest of the evening. The next day, everything seemed just as normal, but I felt that he remembered it too. At breakfast, he moved my teacup closer and said in a calm tone, "You forgot the sugar," even though I hadn't even asked. I took a spoon and our fingers met again. We both pretended it was nothing, but the same tense pause hung in the air. Later, when Mom went to the store, we were left alone. He sat in a chair with his phone, and I settled onto the couch with a book. There was a distance between us, but I could feel his gaze. It lingered longer than it should have. I hid behind the pages, but it only made my heart pound even harder. The simple silence of the house was turning into an electrified field, and every one of our short conversations or accidental movements only amplified it. In the evening, Mom called a friend and went to her place, leaving us alone. I was sitting in the kitchen with a mug of tea. He came in and, without a word, set his mug next to mine. He sat across from me, but after a couple of minutes he moved closer, as if it was more comfortable. We talked about little things, about work, about groceries, about what we needed to do tomorrow. But all of it was just a cover for the long pauses when our eyes met, and neither of us looked away. He suddenly said, "You always make the house cozier." I was embarrassed and pretended it was just a compliment and changed the subject. But deep down, I knew that phrases like that aren't said by accident. Even the simplest words sounded like they were hiding more than either of us was ready to admit. Sometimes he would linger at the sink while I was washing a mug and just stand there, as if he was waiting. I could feel his gaze on me, and my hands would start to move slower. He would grab a towel and dry the dishes, but he would do it so slowly that time seemed to stretch. Suddenly he said, "You always do everything so carefully. I could watch you forever." I looked up and silence hung between us, filled with my heart beating louder than the water. I gave an awkward smile and he did too and went back to the plates. But inside me, that phrase had lit a warmth that was impossible to hide behind our normal daily routine. After that evening, our daily lives seemed to change. Every morning became special. I would walk into the kitchen, and he would already be sitting at the table with a newspaper and a cup of coffee. "Good morning," he'd say in a normal voice, but there was the same soft spark in his eyes that I couldn't forget. I'd put on the kettle, and he would stand up to get me a mug from the top shelf, even though I could reach it myself. His hand would linger near mine a little longer than it needed to, and even such a simple action turned into a sign. At breakfast, he would always put a piece of bread or an apple on my plate and say, "You'll like this." Mom didn't notice anything special, but I could feel a quiet, invisible connection building between us, one that filled the house more and more. In the evening, when the three of us would have dinner, I would catch his gaze more and more often. He would listen to Mom, nod, and say something in response, but sometimes he would let his eyes rest on me for a second. I would pretend to be busy with my plate or the conversation, but inside I would immediately feel uneasy. After dinner, we'd clean the table, and he would again be right next to me. His hand might accidentally brush against mine when we both went for the same plate. And then a short pause would hang between us. "I'll take out the trash myself, don't worry," he'd say in a tone that sounded more like caring than just helping. I'd nod, trying not to smile too obviously. And it was in these moments that our ordinary house was filled with something new, quiet, and tense, something that only the two of us felt. Sometimes, when Mom left to run errands, these moments became even more obvious. He might be sitting in the living room with a book, and I would walk past and he would suddenly ask, "What's the rush?" Even though I wasn't in a hurry at all. His voice was calm, but it had that same hidden softness. I would stop, give a neutral answer, and still feel the tension between us thicken. There were evenings when we'd watch TV together. He would purposely sit closer than he needed to and toss a blanket in a way that would cover me too. "Don't get cold," he'd say simply, but those words made me feel warm in a completely different way. I stayed silent, pretending to be engrossed in the screen, but in reality, I could only feel his presence next to me. And the more often this happened, the less our ordinary life seemed the same to me. Sometimes we'd linger in the kitchen until late at night. I'd be drinking tea, he'd be sitting across from me, and our conversations would flow easily, about our childhood, our habits, about little things that no one would discuss just for the sake of it. He would listen carefully, sometimes smirk, sometimes look at me as if he was trying to remember every one of my words. In moments of silence, he might just reach out and move the sugar bowl closer to me or straighten a mug, and in doing so, his fingers would lightly brush against mine. Seemed like an accident, but it happened too often. In the silence, I would catch myself waiting for these brief moments more than for the conversations themselves. And it was in this simple, ordinary night that a feeling of something forbidden but incredibly alluring was born. Sometimes he would linger longer than he needed to. The tea had long been drunk, the conversation had died down, but he was still sitting across from me, as if he didn't want to leave. The lamplight made the kitchen feel intimate, almost foreign to our house. He would look straight at me, calmly but so intently that I couldn't take it and would look away. Then he would get up, come closer and take my mug, saying, "I'll clean up." His hand would touch mine again, and in that instant it was as if the whole world had disappeared. We both stayed silent, as if afraid that any word would break this silence. But it was in this pause that everything was felt. The tension, the interest, and the fact that our normal everyday life had long since stopped being just that. It happened that these moments would carry over into the morning. I'd walk into the kitchen, sleepy in my robe, and he would already be sitting at the table, stirring his coffee with a spoon. "Good morning," he'd say a little too casually, and there was a warmth in his gaze that woke me up faster than any tea. He would get up, get me a mug, and pour me water, even though I could have done it myself. "You look like you didn't sleep all night," he would say in a low voice. And there was more care in that phrase than a simple comment. I would laugh, answer briefly, but inside I could feel how every little thing he did seemed to bring us closer. Even such simple moments, the kettle, the mugs, the morning light, turned into signs that only we understood. Sometimes on these mornings everything seemed especially obvious. I would get the bread, and he would already be handing me a plate. Our fingers would touch, and he would seem to purposely hold on to that moment. "You're doing everything too fast, don't rush," he would say calmly, but with a slight smirk that made my insides clench. We would sit across from each other, and the silence between us felt louder than the radio in the background. He would watch me as if by accident, but I felt it in every cell of my body. Even when he was just reading the news on his phone, his hand might accidentally touch mine on the table. And then I knew that our normal breakfast had long since stopped being just breakfast and had become part of the game that was binding us more and more tightly. During the day, this feeling was just as strong. We might be unloading groceries together after a trip to the store. I'd be taking out the products, he'd be standing next to me and taking them from my hands. Sometimes he would grab a bag a little before I had a chance to let go. And our fingers would linger on each other, as if on purpose. "You're carrying everything on yourself again," he'd say with a slight reproach and at the same time with some hidden concern. I would smile, answer that I could handle it, but my chest would feel nervously warm. Or when I was reaching for something on the top shelf, he would come too close to help, and I would feel his shoulder next to me. Everything seemed normal. The kitchen, the groceries, the conversations. But it was in these simple moments that a tension was born. A tension that we both had already stopped hiding from ourselves. Sometimes this would show up even in the smallest chores around the house. I'd be doing laundry and hanging it up and he would walk by and stop. "Let me help." His hands would be next to mine on the clothespins, and each time, it felt as if we were purposely holding on to that moment. I would try to distract myself talking about trivial things, but I could feel the tension growing. Or when I was dusting in the living room, he would come up and straighten a vase, even though it was already straight. "That's prettier," he'd throw out calmly, but his look gave away more. Even when we were just sitting next to each other watching a movie, his hand would rest on the couch so close that the distance between us disappeared. And all of this, the simplest everyday things, turned into an invisible language that we both spoke silently. Sometimes in the evening, when Mom went to a neighbor's for tea, everything became even more noticeable. I'd sit on the couch with a book. He would turn on the TV, but his gaze would still linger on me. He might ask, "What are you reading?" and sit down closer than he needed to. I would answer briefly, but in that moment our eyes would meet, and the room would immediately become quieter. He would hand me a blanket, covering me as if by accident, and say, "It's warmer this way." I would smile, pretending not to notice, but my heart would start to beat faster. Even these ordinary evenings, a book, a TV, the soft light of a lamp, turned into a small secret, filled with a flirtation that we never spoke out loud. Sometimes these evenings would drag on longer than usual. We'd sit next to each other under one blanket. He'd comment on something in the movie, I'd laugh. And in that moment, he would look at me a little longer than a simple joke would allow. In the pauses between words, I could feel his shoulder next to me and the warmth that came from him. He might suddenly say in a low voice, "It's always cozier with you." And he would immediately turn back to the screen, as if it were a random phrase. But my insides would flip, and I couldn't hear what was happening in the movie anymore. Even when we were silent, the silence between us was so rich that every gesture and every look became part of the game that we both understood but never talked about. Sometimes after evenings like these, I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. I would hear his footsteps in the hallway, the quiet closing of his bedroom door, and my heart would start to beat faster, as if we were sitting next to each other again. The next day, everything looked just as familiar: breakfast, conversations about little things. But a hidden subtext was tucked into every phrase. He might hand me a teacup and say, "Careful, it's hot." And his fingers would touch mine a little longer. Or he would straighten my collar, saying, "You were in a rush again," and smile in a way that made me blush and turn away. Our house seemed to be living a normal life, but I found myself thinking more and more often that this simple concern was more than it seemed. And it was in these little things that an invisible connection grew between us, one that had long since stopped being an accident. With each passing day, this connection felt stronger. We might be putting away groceries together, and he would suddenly remark, "You do everything so carefully that from the outside, it looks like you're the lady of the house." I would laugh, trying to change the subject, but his words would stay in my head. Or in the evening, when I would sit down at the table with my laptop, he would come over and set a cup of tea next to me, just saying, "So it doesn't get cold." His gestures looked ordinary, but in each of them there was more than just simple concern. Sometimes, as he walked past, he would lightly touch my shoulder or back, as if by accident. But this accident happened too often. And I understood that a game without words had been going on between us for a long time. One that made every little thing significant and every day special. One evening, everything came to a head. Mom was late at her friend's, and we were alone in the kitchen. I was putting on the kettle, and he was standing next to me, silently helping to clear the table. When I reached for a mug, his hand covered mine, and this time, neither of us pulled our fingers away. We froze, and in that silence, all we could hear was the water boiling. He looked at me so intently, as if he wanted to say everything at once, and quietly said, "You know, I can't hide this anymore." I didn't answer with words, I just stayed in his hands, and that was enough. In that moment, it became clear that our normal life together had long since turned into something more, and there was no point in pretending that everything was the same as before.